stay away.
Look at me. I won't hurt you. I swear it.
She flinched violently when his gloved hand grazed her waist. "Please, Your Grace," she whispered, her eyes wide with unspeakable terror. "Do not touch me." The Duke of Rothsay, a man governed by rigid Victorian rules, froze. But when her silk sleeve slipped, exposing a canvas of brutal, blackened bruises, every rule he ever knew ceased to exist. London, 1884. The spring season was in full, ruthless swing, a glittering facade masking the brutal commerce of the marriage mart. In the grand ballroom of the Duchess of Marlborough's estate on Grosvenor Square, 1,000 beeswax candles cast a golden hue over the city's elite. Yet, for Miss Amelia Cavendish, the light offered no warmth. It only illuminated the gilded cage in which she was trapped. Amelia stood near the heavy velvet drapes, her posture painfully rigid. She was dressed in an exquisite gown of emerald silk, a strategic choice made by her stepbrother, Richard Danvers, Viscount of Lockwood. The high lace collar and long, tight sleeves were the height of fashion, but for Amelia, they served a much more sinister purpose: concealment. Richard's fingers dug into the fabric of her waist, his voice a low, venomous hiss in her ear. "Smile, Amelia. You look like a corpse. Lord Harrington is watching, and if you do not secure his proposal tonight, you will learn the true meaning of regret when we return to Curzon Street." Amelia forced her lips to curve upward, fighting the nausea that rolled in her stomach. Lord Harrington was a man thrice her age, known for his cruel temper and vast fortune. Richard, having gambled away the Cavendish inheritance in the hells of Street James's, needed Harrington's money to avoid ruin. Amelia was merely the collateral. Across the room, standing beside a pillar of imported Italian marble, was Alistair Montgomery, the Duke of Rothsay. At 32, Alistair was a formidable presence. He was a man of absolute order, renowned in the House of Lords for his icy demeanor and unyielding adherence to protocol. He detested the frivolity of the season and rarely participated in its games. Society whispered that the Duke's heart was as impenetrable as the stone walls of his ancestral estate in the Scottish Highlands. Tonight, however, his sharp gaze was fixed entirely on the trembling girl in emerald green. Alistair possessed a keen eye for human behavior. He had seen the way Richard Danvers grabbed his stepsister. He recognized the predatory gleam in the Viscount's eyes and the distinct, hunted look in Amelia's. She was beautiful, yes, with her pale complexion and dark, intelligent eyes, but it was her profound vulnerability that commanded his attention. She did not look like a woman eager to dance. She looked like a prisoner marching toward the gallows. Driven by an impulse he could not name and certainly could not justify, Alistair crossed the ballroom. The crowd parted for him instinctively, conversations dropping to hushed whispers as the elusive Duke of Rothsay made a beeline for the disgraced Cavendish girl. "Viscount Lockwood," Alistair said, his voice a rich, authoritative baritone that cut through the music. Richard spun around, his irritation instantly melting into a mask of sycophantic delight. "Your Grace." What an unexpected honor. Alistair did not look at Richard. His eyes were locked on Amelia. Up close, the terror in her eyes was even more pronounced. A fine sheen of sweat dotted her upper lip, and her breathing was shallow, erratic. "Miss Cavendish," Alistair said, executing a flawless, shallow bow. "I find myself in need of a distraction from the politics of the room. Would you do me the honor of this waltz?" The request sent a shockwave through the immediate vicinity. The Duke of Rothsay did not waltz, and he certainly did not ask impoverished, scandal-adjacent women to be his partners. Richard practically pushed Amelia forward. "She would be delighted, Your Grace, absolutely delighted." Amelia's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. To refuse a duke was social suicide. A transgression Richard would punish severely. But to accept meant movement, contact, and the very real possibility that the agony hidden beneath her silk gown would betray her. With trembling hands, she placed her fingers upon the Duke's offered arm. He led her to the center of the floor as the string quartet struck up a sweeping Strauss melody. Alistair turned to face her, raising his right hand to her waist. The moment his gloved palm made contact with the silk at her side, Amelia let out a sharp, choked gasp. Her entire body recoiled, stiffening like a board, and her eyes squeezed shut in a poorly concealed grimace of absolute agony. "Please, Your Grace," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the music, frantic and pleading. "Please, do not touch me." Alistair froze, his hand hovering a fraction of an inch above her waist. The societal protocol he so rigidly adhered to dictated that he should step back, take offense, and leave her on the floor for such an erratic outburst. A gentleman did not force a lady. A duke did not tolerate public humiliation. But Alistair did not step back. His piercing blue eyes searched her face. This was not the coy reluctance of a debutante playing hard to get. This was the raw, unfiltered terror of a woman anticipating physical trauma. "Are you unwell, Miss Cavendish?" he asked quietly, his voice lowering to a register, meant only for her. I am merely fatigued, Your Grace," she stammered, opening her eyes but refusing to meet his gaze. "The heat of the room. I beg your pardon. I cannot dance." "Then we shall not dance," Alistair stated firmly. Ignoring the stares of 100 gossiping aristocrats, he offered his arm once more. "Allow me to escort you to the conservatory. It is cooler there, and we will be away from the prying eyes of your brother." Amelia hesitated, glancing terrified toward the edge of the room where Richard stood, his face darkening with suspicion. Seeing her fear, Alistair stepped deliberately into her line of sight, physically blocking Richard from her view. "You are with me, Miss Cavendish," Alistair said, a subtle steel entering his tone. "No one in this room will dare question my actions. Walk with me." The conservatory of the Marlborough estate was a sprawling glass structure, heavy with the scent of night-blooming jasmine and damp earth. Away from the suffocating heat of the ballroom, the cool air provided immediate relief. Alistair led Amelia down a secluded pathway flanked by towering ferns and exotic orchids, stopping near a stone bench partially hidden by a heavy velvet curtain used to block drafts. "Sit!" he commanded, though his tone was surprisingly gentle. Amelia obeyed, her legs practically giving out beneath her. She clutched her reticule so tightly, her knuckles were white. She was acutely aware of the danger she was in. She was alone in a dimly lit room with the most powerful nobleman in London, having just insulted him on the dance floor, and Richard was undoubtedly counting the seconds until he could corner her. "Breathe, Amelia," Alistair said, using her Christian name without permission, a startling breach of etiquette that sent a jolt of shock through her. He remained, standing, keeping a respectful distance, his hands clasped behind his back. "You are safe here." "You do not understand, Your Grace," she whispered, a tear finally escaping her eye and tracking through the powder on her cheek. "My brother, he will not tolerate this. He expects me to be with Lord Harrington." "He, your brother," Alistair interrupted coldly, "is a known degenerate who owes half the syndicates in London. I care nothing for his expectations." Amelia looked up at him, startled by his blunt assessment. "Then why did you approach me? Why single me out?" "Because," Alistair began, his brow furrowing as he struggled to articulate an impulse he barely understood himself. "You looked as though you were walking to your execution, and when I placed my hand on your waist, you reacted as if I had pressed a branding iron to your skin." He took a slow step forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Who did this to you?" Amelia's blood ran cold. "No one. I am clumsy. I had a fall." "Do not insult my intelligence, Miss Cavendish," Alistair cut in, though not unkindly. "I have served in the military. I know the difference between the flinch of a clumsy fall and the flinch of repeated trauma, panic, seized her. If the Duke discovered the truth, if a scandal erupted, Richard would kill her. It wasn't a metaphor. She knew the violence her stepbrother was capable of. She stood up abruptly, desperate to escape. I must return. I must. As she moved to push past him, her heel caught on the uneven stone floor. She stumbled forward, a cry of alarm escaping her lips. Alistair reacted with lightning speed. He reached out to catch her, his large hands gripping her upper arms to steady her. Amelia screamed. It was a wretched, guttural sound of pure, unadulterated pain that echoed through the glass walls of the conservatory. Her legs gave way, and as she collapsed against him, the delicate seam of her tight emerald sleeve, strained by the sudden movement, ripped open at the shoulder. Alistair caught her easily, lowering her gently back onto the stone bench. But as he pulled his hands away, his eyes locked onto her torn sleeve. The pale skin of her upper arm was unrecognizable. It was a horrifying tapestry of violence. Deep, mottled bruises in sickly shades of purple, black, and jaundiced yellow completely covered her shoulder and bicep. Some marks were old and fading, others were terrifyingly fresh, shaped in the distinct, undeniable pattern of a man's gripping fingers. The air in the conservatory seemed to vanish. Alistair Montgomery, the stoic, unbreakable Duke of Rothsay, felt something snap deep within his chest. The rigid code of Victorian propriety, the unspoken rules of non-interference, the polite blindness of high society, all of it shattered in a single blinding instant. Amelia sobbed, frantically trying to pull the torn fabric over the grotesque marks, her body shaking violently. "Please," she begged, "please, you cannot tell anyone. He will kill me. Richard will kill me." A cold, terrifying fury descended upon Alistair. It was a quiet rage, far more dangerous than any outburst. He knelt before her, entirely ignoring the dirt staining his expensive evening trousers. Carefully, deliberately, he reached out, not touching her skin, but gently pulling the torn fabric back into place. "He will never touch you again," Alistair said. His voice was completely devoid of emotion, yet it carried the weight of an absolute decree. Before Amelia could process his words, the heavy velvet curtain behind them was violently pushed aside. Richard Danvers burst into the alcove, his face purple with rage. "Amelia!" Richard barked, stepping forward with his hand raised, completely oblivious to the danger kneeling before his stepsister. "What is the meaning of this? You disappear with the Duke? You tear your gown like a common streetwalker? And keep Lord Harrington waiting? Get up this instant, you ungrateful wretch!" Alistair stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, and lethal. He turned to face the Viscount. Alistair was several inches taller and significantly broader than Richard. The Duke did not shout. He did not raise his hands. He simply stared at Richard with eyes that promised absolute destruction. "Viscount Lockwood," Alistair said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register. "You will leave this estate immediately. You will return to your home, and you will wait for my solicitors in the morning." Richard stopped dead, his arrogance faltering as he finally registered the murderous look in the Duke's eyes. "Your Grace? I do not understand. My sister." "Miss Cavendish," Alistair interrupted, his tone brokering. "No argument is no longer under your guardianship." Richard let out a nervous, disbelieving laugh. "You cannot be serious. She is my ward. You have no legal right." In a blur of motion, Alistair closed the distance between them. He grabbed Richard by the lapels of his evening coat, slamming the Viscount backward against the iron framework of the conservatory glass with enough force to rattle the panes. "Let me be unequivocally clear, Danvers," Alistair snarled, leaning in so only Richard could hear. "If you speak her name again, if you come within 100 yards of her, I will not just ruin you financially, I will ruin you physically. I will make your life a living, breathing hell until you beg me for the mercy of the Thames. Do you understand me?" Richard, choking on his own terror, could only nod frantically. Alistair threw him aside in disgust. He turned back to Amelia, who was watching him with wide, disbelieving eyes. The strict, unyielding Duke had just physically assaulted a peer of the realm and openly kidnapped a lady. He had broken every rule of his life in the span of 5 minutes, and he did not care. Alistair removed his own tailored evening coat and draped it gently over Amelia's trembling shoulders, concealing her torn dress and her bruises. "Come, Amelia," he said, offering her his hand, not as a dance partner, but as a protector. "We are leaving." The carriage ride through the gas-lit streets of Mayfair was enveloped in a suffocating, heavy silence. The Duke's midnight black brougham rattled over the cobblestones of Piccadilly, the rhythmic clopping of the horse's hooves, the only sound competing with Amelia's ragged breathing. She sat huddled in the corner of the velvet squabs, Alistair's heavy evening coat swallowing her fragile frame. Alistair sat opposite her, an impenetrable shadow in the dim carriage. He did not speak, nor did he attempt to cross the distance between them. His earlier fury had not dissipated. It had simply crystallized into something far more dangerous. He was a man of the House of Lords, a veteran of the Zulu War, and a strategist who possessed the wealth of a small nation. Richard Danvers had no idea of the Leviathan he had just awakened. "Your Grace," Amelia finally whispered, her voice trembling as the carriage turned onto the sweeping expanse of Park Lane. "You must let me out. If I return to Curzon Street now, I can tell him I felt faint." "I can tell him you were merely acting as a gentleman. If you keep me here, the scandal, you will be ruined." Alistair's eyes caught the amber glow of a passing street lamp. They were chips of blue ice. "My reputation is a fortress of my own making, Miss Cavendish. It can withstand the gossips of the ton. You, however, cannot withstand another night in that house." "He is my legal guardian," she pleaded, a fresh wave of despair washing over her. "The law is on his side. He will bring the Metropolitan Police. He will bring Lord Harrington." "Let them come," Alistair replied softly, the absolute certainty in his voice sending a strange, terrifying thrill through her chest. "They will find the gates of Rothsay House barred to them, and if Harrington so much as sets foot on my property, I will have him thrown into the Thames." The carriage lurched to a halt before a massive wrought-iron gate. Beyond it stood Rothsay House, a looming Palladian mansion that looked less like a London townhouse and more like an impenetrable citadel. Footmen swarmed the carriage the moment it stopped. Alistair bypassed them all. He opened the door himself and reached in, offering his hand. Amelia hesitated, looking at his large gloved palm. Slowly, she placed her trembling fingers in his. He did not grip her tightly, he merely guided her down, treating her with the delicate reverence one might afford spun glass. Once inside the grand marble foyer, Alistair immediately began issuing orders. "Summon Mrs. Dalton," he commanded his bewildered butler, "and send a rider to Harley Street. I want Dr. Charles Lanyon here within the hour. Tell him it is a matter of the utmost urgency, and he is to speak to no one." Mrs. Dalton, a stern but motherly housekeeper, with silver hair, arrived moments later. She took one look at Amelia's pale, tear-stained face and the oversized masculine coat draped over her torn gown, and her professional demeanor softened instantly. "Mrs. Dalton," Alistair said, his voice lowering. "Miss Cavendish has suffered a terrible ordeal. You are to take her to the Rose Suite, draw a warm bath, burn the gown she is wearing, and provide her with whatever she requires. When the doctor arrives, bring him to her immediately." "Yes, Your Grace," Mrs. Dalton murmured, gently placing a hand on Amelia's uninjured arm. "Come with me, my dear. You are safe now." Amelia looked back at Alistair as she was led up the sweeping mahogany staircase. He was already turning away, his mind clearly shifting to the impending war. An hour later, Dr. Lanyon, a discreet physician favored by the aristocracy, emerged from the Rose Suite. Alistair was waiting in the hallway, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. "Well?" Alistair demanded. Dr. Lanyon sighed, rubbing his temples. "It is grave, Your Grace. The contusions on her shoulder and ribs are severe, consistent with a brutal physical assault. But that is not what concerns me most." Alistair went dangerously still. "Explain." "She is severely malnourished, but her pulse is erratic, and her pupils are dilated," Dr. Lanyon said, in a hushed tone. "I drew a small sample of her blood and examined her humors. Your Grace, she is being poisoned." Slowly. The floor seemed to drop out from beneath Alistair. "Poisoned?" "Arsenic, I suspect, mixed with regular, small doses of laudanum," the doctor confirmed grimly. "It is a coward's method. It creates the illusion of a naturally frail, sickly constitution. It keeps the victim docile, confused, and entirely dependent on their caretaker. Over time, her heart would simply give out. The coroner would rule it a natural failure of a weak disposition. It is a miracle you pulled her from that house tonight. A few more months, and she would have been dead." Alistair did not react immediately. He stared blindly at the ornate wallpaper, the monstrous reality of Richard Danvers' cruelty washing over him. Danvers wasn't just abusing her to force a marriage. He was systematically executing her. "Treat her, Charles," Alistair said, his voice an empty, hollow rasp that frightened the doctor more than any shout could have. "Whatever the cost, whatever the medicine, keep her alive." As the doctor scurried away, Alistair walked into his dark study, poured a glass of scotch he did not drink, and stared into the dying embers of the fireplace. The rules of engagement had just changed. This was no longer a rescue. It was an extermination. The next morning, London exploded. The Morning Post and the Society Gazette ran sensational, thinly veiled columns about the shocking abduction at Grosvenor Square and the erratic behavior of a certain Highland Duke. Rumors flew through the drawing rooms of Mayfair like wildfire. Some claimed Amelia had seduced the Duke to escape her debts. Others swore the Duke had gone mad and dragged her out by her hair. In the sunlit breakfast room of Rothsay House, Amelia sat in a plush velvet armchair, dressed in a soft cashmere wrapper provided by Mrs. Dalton. The bruising on her face was expertly hidden, but her eyes were shadowed with exhaustion. Alistair sat across from her, a copy of the Morning Post discarded on the table. "You must not read them," Alistair said gently, noting her gaze lingering on the newspaper. "They are saying I am ruined," she said quietly, her voice devoid of emotion. "That I am a fallen woman." "They are saying what men like your brother pay them to say," Alistair corrected sharply. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Amelia, Dr. Lanyon told me everything last night. About the poison." Amelia squeezed her eyes shut, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I suspected it," she whispered. "My tea always tasted bitter. And my mind, it was always so foggy. I could not think straight enough to fight him." "Why?" Alistair asked, his voice raw with restrained fury. "Why would he go to such lengths to kill you? If he wanted Lord Harrington's money, why risk a murder charge?" Amelia took a trembling breath. "Because I have an inheritance." "When my mother died, she placed her fortune, nearly £80,000, in an ironclad trust. Richard cannot touch a single penny of it. It transfers to me on my 21st birthday, which is merely 3 months away." The pieces fell perfectly into place in Alistair's strategic mind. "Unless you marry a man who agrees to sign it over to him," Alistair surmised. "Or, if you die before your 21st birthday, the money defaults to your closest living relative." "Your stepbrother." "Harrington agreed to split the inheritance with Richard once we were wed," she explained, looking down at her hands. "But Richard is impatient. He has gambling debts with violent men in Soho. I think he decided that my death would be faster and cleaner than waiting for Harrington to break my will." Before Alistair could respond, the heavy oak doors of the breakfast room opened. The butler stepped in, looking profoundly uncomfortable. "Your Grace, Viscount Lockwood and Lord Harrington are at the front gates. They are accompanied by Magistrate Cole of Scotland Yard and 2 constables. They have a warrant for the return of Miss Cavendish, citing kidnapping and unlawful detainment. Amelia let out a terrified gasp, shrinking back into her chair as if trying to disappear into the upholstery. Alistair stood up slowly, meticulously smoothing the lapels of his morning coat. His face was a mask of terrifying calm. "Mrs. Dalton!" he called out. The housekeeper immediately stepped into the room from the corridor. "Stay with Miss Cavendish. Lock the door behind me." Alistair walked through the grand halls of his home, out the heavy front doors, and stood at the top of the marble steps. The morning sun illuminated the chaotic scene at the gates. Richard stood looking smug and emboldened, flanked by the sneering Lord Harrington and a nervous-looking magistrate. "Open the gates, Montgomery!" Richard shouted through the iron bars. "I have a lawful warrant. Hand over my sister, or by God, I will have you dragged to Newgate Prison." Alistair signaled to the guards to open the gates, allowing the men to step into the courtyard, though they were immediately surrounded by Alistair's massive Highland estate workers, who had been strategically brought down to London overnight. Magistrate Cole stepped forward, holding up a piece of parchment. "Your Grace, I apologize for the intrusion, but Viscount Lockwood has sworn an affidavit. You are harboring his legal ward against her will. You must release her to his custody immediately." Alistair descended the stairs slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. "Magistrate Cole, a pleasure. Tell me, does an affidavit of guardianship hold weight if the guardian in question is currently under investigation for high treason and attempted murder?" The courtyard fell dead silent. Richard's smug smile vanished, replaced by a chalky pallor. "What lies are you spinning, Montgomery?" Alistair did not look at Richard. He kept his eyes locked on the magistrate. "Last night, I dispatched my solicitors to Bow Street and a private investigator to the docks at Wapping. Viscount Lockwood does not just owe gambling debts, magistrate. He has been selling naval artillery secrets to Russian sympathizers to cover his losses. The evidence was handed over to the Home Secretary 2 hours ago." Harrington took a sudden, sharp step away from Richard. Treason was a hanging offense. "Furthermore," Alistair continued, his voice ringing with absolute authority, "Dr. Charles Lanyon has provided sworn medical testimony that Viscount Lockwood has been systematically poisoning Miss Cavendish with arsenic. The Metropolitan Police are currently turning the Curzon Street townhouse inside out. I imagine they have already found the vials in his desk." Richard panicked. He lunged toward the gates, but 2 of Alistair's estate workers caught him effortlessly, slamming him face first into the cobblestones. "Let him go!" Richard screamed, thrashing wildly. "She is mine! You have no right!" Alistair walked over to where Richard was pinned, looking down at the pathetic creature with utter disgust. "I have every right, Danvers," Alistair said coldly. He turned to Magistrate Cole, who was staring at the scene in shock. "Take this filth off my property, Magistrate. And inform the Home Secretary that Miss Cavendish is now under the absolute, irrevocable protection of the House of Rothsay. Anyone who attempts to approach her will answer to me." As the constables dragged a screaming Richard Danvers away, and Lord Harrington scurried off like a frightened rat, Alistair turned back toward his fortress. The battle was won, but as he looked up at the window of the Rose Suite, he knew the war for Amelia's soul, and perhaps his own deeply buried heart had only just begun. For 3 agonizing weeks, Rothsay House transformed into a sanctuary of healing and whispered prayers. The physical withdrawal from the laudanum and the slow detoxification of arsenic from Amelia's system was a harrowing ordeal. There were nights when she woke screaming, her sheets soaked in sweat, convinced Richard was in the room. In those darkest hours, it was not Mrs. Dalton who sat by her bed, but the Duke himself. Alistair Montgomery, a man who had commanded battalions and dictated national policy, spent his nights reading poetry in a low, soothing baritone until Amelia's erratic breathing slowed. He never crossed the boundary of propriety, never sat on the edge of the mattress, but his presence was a steadfast lighthouse in her tempest-tossed mind. Slowly, the jaundiced tint left her skin, replaced by a vibrant, porcelain glow. The horrific bruises on her arm faded from angry violet to muted yellow, and finally, to nothing at all. Yet, the peace of Park Lane was a fragile illusion. High society was a venomous beast, and the law of the land was notoriously unkind to unmarried women. On a rain-swept Tuesday, the illusion shattered. Alistair was in his study, reviewing the latest dispatches from his solicitors, when his butler ushered in a man wrapped in a damp ulster coat. It was Mr. Vane, his chief legal counsel. Vane looked remarkably grim. "Your Grace," Vane said, bowing hastily. "We have a catastrophic complication. It concerns the Court of Chancery." Alistair set his pen down, the familiar ice returning to his veins. "Richard Danvers is rotting in Newgate Prison, awaiting trial for treason. What possible threat could the Chancery pose?" "It is not Danvers, Your Grace," Vane explained, pulling a rolled parchment from his briefcase. "With Danvers imprisoned and facing the gallows, he is legally incapacitated. Therefore, Miss Cavendish's guardianship has reverted to her next of kin. Her maternal uncle, Lord Reginald Crawford of Cornwall, has petitioned the Lord Chancellor for immediate custody." Alistair's jaw clenched. Crawford is a notorious bankrupt. He lost his estate to the railway syndicates 3 years ago. "Exactly," Vane said gravely. "Which is why he wants Miss Cavendish. Her trust fund unlocks on her 21st birthday. Crawford has secured a court order. He will be in London by tomorrow to collect her. Under the law, you have no legal right to keep her. If you refuse him, you will be in contempt of the Crown, and the army could be called to enforce the writ." Alistair stood, pacing the length of the Persian rug. The trap was closing again. He had saved her from a quick death by poison, only to hand her over to a slow death of financial exploitation and imprisonment in Cornwall. He could not adopt her. He was not of age to be considered a paternal figure by the courts. He could not simply buy Crawford off, for the man's greed would never be sated. There was only one impenetrable legal defense. Alistair did not hesitate. He left the study and climbed the sweeping staircase to the library, where Amelia was seated by the fireplace, a heavy tome of Greek mythology resting on her lap. She looked up as he entered, her dark eyes instantly catching the tension radiating from his broad shoulders. "What has happened?" she asked, her newfound strength faltering slightly. Alistair crossed the room and stood before her. He looked down into the face of the woman who had entirely dismantled his rigid, structured life. He had spent his youth building a fortress around his heart, convinced that duty and logic were the only masters a duke should serve. Yet, looking at Amelia, her resilience, her sharp intellect, the way she had fought her way back from the brink of death, he realized his fortress was not a sanctuary, it was a prison. "Your uncle, Lord Crawford, has petitioned the courts for your custody," Alistair said evenly. He watched the terror instantly flood her features, but before she could panic, he knelt before her chair. It was an astonishing act of submission from a man of his unparalleled rank. "He holds a legal writ," Alistair continued, his voice softening, "but there is a higher authority than the Court of Chancery. I have dispatched a rider to the Archbishop of Canterbury. As a peer of the realm, I am entitled to request a special license." Amelia stared at him, her breath catching in her throat. "A special license? For what, Your Grace?" "For marriage," Alistair said. He reached out, gently taking her small, ungloved hand in his. "Amelia, I am a man who has lived entirely by rules. I despised chaos. I detested vulnerability. But the night you begged me not to touch you, you broke every rule I ever knew. And thank God you did." Tears welled in Amelia's eyes, slipping down her flushed cheeks. "You would marry me out of pity? To save me from the courts?" "No," Alistair said fiercely, his grip tightening on her hand. "I am marrying you because the thought of my life without you in it is entirely unacceptable to me. I am not asking to own you, Amelia. I am asking for the absolute honor of standing beside you. Marry me, and your uncle's writ becomes useless. Marry me, and you will never fear another man, so long as you draw breath." Amelia looked into his piercing blue eyes, seeing no pity, no arrogance, only a fierce, unyielding devotion. She thought of the trembling, broken girl in the emerald dress. That girl was gone. In her place was a survivor, forged in fire, and she was looking at the man who had handed her the sword. "Yes," she whispered, her voice steady and clear. "Yes, Alistair, I will marry you." The wedding took place less than 48 hours later at St. George's, Hanover Square. It was entirely devoid of the suffocating society vultures. There were no gossiping dowagers, no scheming viscounts. The pews were empty save for Mrs. Dalton, Mr. Vane, and the faithful estate workers who had guarded the gates of Park Lane. Amelia wore a simple, elegant gown of ivory silk. It had no high lace collar, and the sleeves were short, leaving her bare, unblemished arms entirely visible. It was a silent, powerful declaration of her freedom. Just as the vicar began the vows, the heavy oak doors of the church slammed open. Lord Reginald Crawford marched down the aisle, clutching a rolled parchment, flanked by 2 constables. "Stop this proceeding!" Crawford bellowed, his face red with exertion. "I hold an injunction from the Lord Chancellor. This woman is my ward." Alistair did not even turn around. He simply held out his free hand. From the front pew, Prime Minister William Gladstone, a longtime political ally of Alistair's late father, stepped out, holding a document bearing the heavy wax seal of Queen Victoria herself. "I am afraid your injunction is moot, Lord Crawford," Gladstone announced, his booming voice echoing in the cavernous nave. "Her Majesty has personally signed a decree emancipating Miss Cavendish from the Danvers and Crawford estates, in light of the treasonous actions of Viscount Lockwood. Furthermore, she is currently standing at the altar with the Duke of Rothesay. Unless you wish to take up your grievances with the Queen, I suggest you leave quietly." Crawford paled, looking from the Prime Minister to the imposing figure of the Duke. Defeated and humiliated, he turned on his heel and fled the church, the constables hurrying after him. Amelia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She looked up at Alistair, a brilliant, radiant smile breaking across her face. He smiled back, a rare, breathtaking sight, and signaled the vicar to continue. When they emerged onto the steps of Hanover Square as the Duke and Duchess of Rothesay, the London sun broke through the heavy rain clouds. Amelia took her husband's arm, not with the terrified grip of a prisoner, but with the confident, unbreakable hold of an equal. 3 months later, on her 21st birthday, Amelia took full control of her £80,000 inheritance. She did not spend it on jewels or ball gowns. Instead, with Alistair's full support and considerable political backing, she established the Cavendish Foundation, a legal and financial trust dedicated to providing sanctuary and legal counsel for women trapped in abusive households. The ton whispered, of course. They always would. But as the Duke and Duchess of Rothesay stood on the balcony of their sprawling Highland estate, overlooking the untamed beauty of the Scottish lochs, the whispers of London society could not reach them. Amelia rested her head against Alistair's shoulder, his strong arm wrapped securely around her waist. She no longer flinched at his touch. She leaned into it, finally safe, finally whole, and entirely loved. What a breathtaking conclusion. Amelia not only escaped her cruel family but found true love and reclaimed her fortune to help others. From a terrified girl to the powerful Duchess of Rothesay, her journey proves that even the darkest wounds can heal. If you loved this historical romance filled with twists, hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more captivating stories.
Hi, my name is Primal Bond Living, the owner and manager of Primal Bond Living. After watching the video, she begged the Duke not to touch her, Then he saw her bruises and broke every rule. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was the shift from fear to protection. The moment he noticed the bruises changed everything emotionally, because it revealed pain she had probably been hiding for a long time. I think stories like this connect deeply with people because they touch on trust, vulnerability, and the powerful impact of someone finally seeing what another person has been silently carrying. Do you think the Duke already sensed something was wrong before he saw the bruises, or did that moment completely change how he viewed her? And why do you think people who've been hurt often struggle to trust kindness at first? I think stories like this remind us how important patience and compassion can be, especially when someone has been through difficult experiences we may not fully understand. If this story stayed with you emotionally, I'd really love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy historical romance stories filled with healing, emotional tension, and protective love, feel free to like and subscribe only if you'd like to see more.